Welcome to the IDB Decarbonization series. My name is Christian Gischler, and I am the co-leader of the Mining, Geothermal, and Hydrocarbon cluster. So before we start, I want to give some logistical details. So the first one is that the mics are all muted, and only the speakers can unmute their mics or the tech support. The second is that if you want to make a question, please use the chat box in the bottom of your screen. And also you can use the simultaneous translation. So you can either go for Spanish or English. In the chat box website, we also uploaded the bios of all the speakers so that you can have, you can be well informed of who they are and what they are working on today. So let's move on to what we are here today to talk. We have developed a series of webinars dedicated to decarbonization. The first of these webinars is dedicated to the hydrocarbon sector. The next session of webinars will be dedicated towards cement, coal-fired plants, heating, and also mining. But for today, let's start with the hydrocarbon sector. So we have called this panel the future of hydrocarbon sector, decarbonization and diversification strategies. So just to give you an idea of what this sector produces in terms of emissions, 9% of all man-made emissions are the result of the production of oil and gas and refining of that same product. So when you burn this product in a combustion, 33% of the emissions are produced from that burning, which can be the process of power plants, industrial, transportation, and so on. So that means that we're talking about an industry that produces around 42% of the global emissions. So in this scenario, oil and gas companies play a critical role to address climate change. So the motivation for this panel and for this series of webinars is to see this industry and this amalgamation of other industries as not as part of the problem, but we rather want to see it as part of the solution and how to get to that solution. So most of the European major hydrocarbon companies have pledged a net zero emissions by 2050. We'll be talking about that, and the speakers will be talking about that. But the most important thing is how to get there and how to perhaps accelerate that net zero to the years before. To discuss this topic, we have invited a very distinguished panel. So to start, we'll have Susan Farrell. Susan Farrell is the Vice President of the managing and consulting firm IHS Markit and the leader of future energy and climate change scenarios. After Susan, we'll have Graham Watkins. He is the acting division chief of the Climate Change and Sustainability Division of the IDB. Following Graham, we'll have Jaime Martín Juez, Executive Director of Technology and Corporate Venturing at Repsol. And last but not least, we'll have Paulo Barcena, Head of Corporate and Strategy at Ecopetrol. So IHS Markit. This is a company that's one of the largest consulting companies in the sector, and it periodically updates and consolidates energy and climate change scenarios. So for this purpose, we have invited Susan Farrell to talk about energy transition scenarios and its impacts on the hydrocarbon industry. Remember, the bio of Susan Farrell is in the chat box. If you click in the bottom button, you will find it there. So Susan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel and to talk about this morning. I'm going to start off. I can assume you can see my slides, Christian, yes?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. I'd like to talk about what the energy transition is. And we view the energy transition as a process of moving towards a lower carbon world. In this past year in 2019, oil and gas made up about 54% of the world's primary energy demand. If you add in coal, that's another 26%. So hydrocarbons account for 80% of primary energy demand. Moving away from that model is not a quick process. It's a long process, and even when we get 30 years out, oil and gas is still going to be a very important player in the energy selection of fuels, but it's going to be less of a player than it is today. And I want to say that this topic is top of mind of oil and gas companies around the world. It's at the board level, and it's discussed in many different ways and how companies should change or adjust their strategies. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Now, if you look at this chart, the pie on the left-hand side looks at greenhouse gas emissions by type. And CO2 is the green, 75% of greenhouse gas emissions are CO2. Methane is 17%. You've got nitrous oxides and some other gases as well, hydrofluorocarbons. But although methane is a much more potent global warming gas and has much worse effects in the short run, CO2 stays in the atmosphere for well over 100 years. And therefore, we look at who are the players in creating CO2. The chart on the right-hand side tells you why we focus on the energy industry. 89% of CO2 emissions are energy related. Now, Christian mentioned that it was 46% or so by the oil and gas companies themselves. But in this case, we're looking at a larger set. So we're including power generation, transport, industry, so all the places that energy is actually used. So of course, the energy industry is absolutely at the forefront of being questioned about what they're doing and how they're changing over time. Now, we look at energy use through three possible scenarios. They're built up from the country level, and we look at what the global import is, but it's very, very data rich and heavy. We have three cases. First is what we call rivalry. It's our base case scenario, and that's everything would go forward the way we are anticipating it now. Technology changes, there are greater efficiencies, there are environmental policies, but there's no revolutionary change. That we look at in what we call our greener scenario, which is the next one down, where there is major change, where there are social and political attitudes that demand that something be done about climate change and the environment. And that results in a much lower demand for hydrocarbons and a very fast penetration of renewables. And then finally, we have a world which rather resembles the one we're in today, which is very dysfunctional, that there are ups and downs in economics and geopolitics, governments come and go, and it leads to a much less certain environment in which to make investments. Now, that seems like a pretty complex process, and it is altogether, but we now have this transformational event of 2020, which we have to flow through the different scenarios and figure out how long the impacts will be. There are so many impacts from this series of events that we have a different set of assumptions on the COVID-19 trajectory, as well as government reactions, as well as economic recovery for the next 5 years in each of our scenarios. And it's the depth and the duration of this pandemic and the recession, which are so great that they have forced dramatic change in thinking about what could be done in the future and also about what should be done in the future. And that flows through our different scenarios. One of the unintended consequences of this terrible downturn in economies is shown in the left-hand chart. And that is a plummeting of CO2 levels to 2011 numbers. The green is the road transport, and the gray is the power. So those were the two big sectors where when road transport in particular came first, just pretty much shut down. At one point, 90% of the gasoline markets in the world were under severe lockdown. And the power came pretty much right after that. This is equivalent to taking out a country's emissions the size of India, which is the third largest emitter in the world after China and the United States. So dramatic import. And what that did is sort of shown as a rising sun on the right-hand side. It cleared the skies over the world's most polluted cities. And the question is that going to be a call to arms by the public to not go back to the way things were? Not for the same reasons, but to try to achieve this in a more rapid way. Now, when we look at who the players are in what is going to determine the energy transition, we look at governments, we look at companies, we look at financial institutions, and then we look at the NGOs and other stakeholders, including the regular populace. And I'd like to talk through with you what we think each of these are going to be doing now and going forward. Let's look at government first. This is a chart that represents how the recovery and stimulus packages that have been put in place over the past couple of months are going to hinder or help the energy transition. The direction of the arrow indicates whether the programs are tied to doing something to improve the either climate or air pollution, and the length of it is how strong they are. So if you're going up, you got slightly better than where you started from at the end of 2019. And if you're going down, it was slightly hindering an energy transition. And the starting point, the horizontal line here, the dotted line, is the G20 median of where all these countries started from at the beginning of the year. So just look at the top for a minute. All the European countries are tying their recovery packages to some sorts of conditions that would make faster the energy transition. I'll give you an example of France. They have tied a 4 billion euro loan to Air France KLM to targets that include an emission reduction on domestic flights of 50% by 2024. Now, the other countries are all not all of them are going down, but most of them are going down. And that is because they took the money and they are focused on getting everybody back to work, no matter what industry they're in. But in particular, if you look at a few of the Latin American countries, Argentina on the far left, for example, has oil companies obligated to maintain production, payrolls, and investment. And they've raised the minimum price for domestic sales in order to provide a price floor when the oil price crashed. Brazil has a relief plan that includes large companies, including airlines and energy companies. So we view this as a lessening of the energy transition, since they will be further supported by the government. And right on the middle of the page, on the right, you see Mexico. And there's some small changes, including airport exemptions which are meant to support travel. On the far right, you see the worst country, that's the United States. And that is because there are a number of programs which are supporting not the energy industry, but certainly airlines. And also this administration rolled back or reduced the regulations that would require much greater fuel standards, which is the biggest part that this arrow goes way down as it does. So the governments have been spending a lot of money, most of them to get the existing economy back going. And a lot of that includes things that relate to energy production and use. So what about companies? This diagram looks at a timeline starting in December 2019 up through May. The red line is the oil price, because we had an oil price crash during that time, as you know. And we have multiple European companies in particular who throughout this period continue to roll out very ambitious emissions targets reductions. On the far left, in December 2019, you have Repsol. So I will be very happy to have them talk about what they've done. But what you've seen is the European companies in particular are leading the charge of the international oil and gas companies and being very proactive in having both decarbonization targets as well as diversification. So if you look at Total and Shell, they are diversifying into wind, to solar, to electric charging stations, to batteries, and to microgrids. So they are diversifying as well as decarbonizing their existing operations. Now, what about national oil companies? Very different groups. One cannot compare national oil companies the way one compares international, as you know. But if we look here, this is, again, just since December. So I'm going to talk a minute about Latin American companies, but we have CNOOC making wind development targets, Qatar making targets, ONGC in India. We even have Petronas. Far right is Petronas India. It looks like I made a typo, but it's Petronas investing in solar projects in India. Now, when we look at the Latin America NOCs, it's a little bit of a different picture. We have Petrobras, who was going to make big investments in renewables in 2018, but under the current CEO, they have pulled back from that. And they have just come out with a plan which absolutely reinforces the fact that they are an oil and gas company and they're going to focus on the deep water. But they plan to spend $100 million a year in CapEx on decarbonizing their operations. We have Pemex, who had great reform ideas, but again, since President Obrador, he stepped back the oil market reforms and canceled the fourth energy auction, which was going to bring private investment into renewables. Very different is Ecopetrol, a company that has strong commitments to reducing CO2 emissions. And again, so happy to be on a panel with them. The final two players, financial institutions and NGOs and shareholders, are all pressing for change from slightly different directions. The financial institutions are worried about climate-related risk. If the market is going away and conditions are getting worse, what about the investment? What does that do for that? So they're pressing the companies to make transparent their plans under different scenarios, including Paris climate target scenarios. So, and in those scenarios, there is very large destruction of demand for hydrocarbons. In order to reach the Paris climate targets, you have a much smaller hydrocarbon sector. But they are pressing companies to come out with exactly explaining what the risk is and what they're doing about it. And then you have the NGOs and stakeholders and activists. And they see this as an opportunity to press harder. Those clean skies, those better cities, less congestion, less air pollution, that really has been an eye-opener. And we don't see that coming down at all. We see it increasing. And finally, I'd like to conclude with how far we have to go. The left-hand side is our last year's long-term scenarios and the emissions outcomes from them. The top three, and they will be changing. Our new scenarios come out in about 2 weeks. So this doesn't reflect the downturn yet in emissions in 2020, but the top three are the plausible scenarios. The bottom two are low emission scenarios that we've run to see how you could get to the Paris climate targets. And in the middle is the gap. So if you look at the yellow line in the middle here, that is is our greenest scenario from last year. And it does not get us to the Paris Climate Agreement targets, which would be the 2-degree world or less by 2100. So there's a long way to go, but the focus by the oil and gas companies is firmly on what they have to do in order to play their part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. We'll have questions for you at the end of the 4 sessions. But now I would like to introduce the second speaker, Graham Watkins. He is the head of the Climate Change Division. And we are very glad to have Graham in the panel because we feel that if we want to do something about oil and gas and how to reduce their carbon footprint, we need to work from the within. We need to work with the oil and gas companies to reduce their carbon footprint, and we are also here to help. Maybe you don't know, but the IDB has a mandate that 30% of its portfolio has to be climate change related, both in mitigation and adaptation. So this is roughly between $5 to $7 billion per year of the entire portfolio, which is about $15 billion per year. So it is very important to have Graham's point of view in how to get there. So he will be talking about aligning the short-term planning with the decarbonization goals for the Latin American region. Graham, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Perhaps we could go to the next slide. So this presentation is coming from a climate perspective. So what's interesting is, though, it's very similar to the previous presentation, which is coming from a different perspective. And ultimately, the argument is that fossil fuel companies are and need to respond to basically changing circumstances, and that those changes may have been accelerated by COVID-19, although I think the jury is out, because many countries, while they've done rescue activities, they still haven't gone into recovery phase yet, and looking at the future economic growth of the country. I think that the European plans, as Susan mentioned, are clearly in one direction, but I think we have to wait and see what's going to happen actually in other countries across the world. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that our interest in doing this is really to begin that discussion, the dialogue, and start talking about what we can do and what can the bank do to actually help companies that may be interested in moving forward in that direction. So what I'm going to do is basically give a background from the climate perspective. I'll try and go through that fairly quickly. What are the main assumptions? But I do want to emphasize that the key from a climate perspective is actually how do you support and smooth out system transitions. This is the whole concept of the just transition. And there are sort of three elements to that. One is the question of market opportunities and how can you enhance market opportunities and grow market share for alternatives. The second is what are the policy shifts, what are the policy triggers that are going to actually drive the transition. And the third is really, and I think Susan sort of mentioned this throughout the presentation, is the question of political will. Because that is going to be a key to change. I also wanted to give one quick example of what happened actually with coal in the United Kingdom, because I think it's interesting from that perspective. And then talk about what we're seeing in fossil fuels, and then talk at the end about some of the options and what our view on some of the possible options are for fossil fuel companies. If you go to the next slide. I also wanted to start out with, virtually everyone is actually on board with the Paris Agreement and on board with the Sustainable Development Goals. There are obviously key actors that are not, but I do want to start from that position that all countries have made these commitments. So I just wanted to start from there, and those commitments have implications. If you go to the next slide. So the commitments basically mean phasing out fossil fuels. Now, again, if you wanted to get to that lower curve that Susan showed, you really need to phase them out by 2050. And that we fairly well understand. And that means replacing generation systems with renewables and fixing the storage problems, the storage channels, the storage challenges. It also means electrifying transport and industry. And then there are a whole series of other actions that need to happen, including addressing the agricultural challenges, regrowing natural capital and creating sinks and things like that. So if you go to the next slide. So for us, the question is when, not if. And that has substantial implications for the fossil fuel industry, I think. The problem that we see, and we've done quite a lot of analysis of this, is that the present carbon budgets are basically more than expended by the fossil fuel plants that exist today and those that are planned. And one of the key things that we've been trying to do when we work with countries is to talk to them about long-term planning. What does it mean in the long term? If you really want to avoid getting into a situation where you're going to have to close down plants and basically lose those assets in the long term. So trying to avoid the question of stranded assets when you're doing your planning. And clearly the planning is long term. So if you go to the next slide. Paula? Well, so this is a sort of a simple analogy. If you really wanted to build a castle in the future, you don't really want to build a house in the interim, because you're going to have to destroy that house to be able to build the castle. It's probably better to build the foundations of the castle from the get-go. And this is the whole concept that we're trying to work with countries, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, and others are working throughout the world on what are called long-term strategies for decarbonization. Coal, oil, and gas plants tend to last about 40 years on average, which means that if you want to get to net zero by 2050, that's only 30 years ago. So anything you build today is likely to be stranded if we assume that we're going to get to net zero by 2050. If not, there are a series of other implications about that. So anything that's really built today is likely to be stranded and potentially will be lost in the long term, depending on what happens with respect to policy changes and market changes as we move forward. Next slide. The question then arises, which Susan already has raised, is whether or not COVID is a taste of the future. What does it offer in terms of opportunities? We've clearly seen that the low demand and high supply, the imbalance between that, has led to substantial numbers of bankruptcies in oil companies. People do want to live in clean cities, bikes, walking, renewable energy, urban transport. There's a lot of interest in that right now. Europe's planning to move in that direction, and they will accelerate the change with the policy shifts that they're putting in place. I would say that right now in Latin America, what we're seeing are mainly rescue plans. The question is, what are the recovery plans going to look like for the more longer term, so the short to medium term? Right where in Latin America, we're right in the midst of the crisis right now, and the focus has to be on liquidity, social protection, and jobs, basically. But there is a question about what's going to happen in the future, and we're already seeing interest in some of these aspects from cities and from countries. And the key question for us is, what's the role of private sector in the future, and what is the private sector going to demand, and what are the private sector investors going to demand? So if you go to the next slide. This is just a quick sojourn to look at coal in the United Kingdom. The UK, some people in the UK have been advertising that they're going to be not using coal anymore for electricity generation and looking at it as a climate win, when actually it's not a climate win. This is a purely economic and political decision-making process that's occurred over a long period of time. It's not a climate issue. And it's interesting though, because it is a transition and it's a substantive transition. But it's been a long time in the coming, and I actually was in Britain through most of this time. Next slide. So in essence, the collapse occurred over about 70 years with little plateaus and falls, but it went from about 1.2 million people employed to now about between 2,000 and 5,000 people employed, which is a huge change. There's about 900,000 people employed in this industry in Latin America at the moment, just for comparison purposes. If you go to the next slide. And ultimately, what drove the change is actually that there were competitive alternatives that were driving coal out of systems, for example, in railways, ovens, industry. The production costs were way too high, so economically speaking, it really didn't have a future, and that could be seen by many people. But if you look at the middle of that graph, what you see is a real spike, which is, I would make a sort of an analogy between that spike and the COVID spike. That spike actually was the union breaking of Margaret Thatcher. And it, in essence, accelerated and showed that you could live without coal. And that was partly what continued that decline over time. But again, it's a political process, it's a market process, it's an economic process. It's not to do with actual climate change. Next slide. And what you're seeing now, as Susan already mentioned, is that you've got a removal, people concerned about climate risk and people pulling back from coal in general, both investors and insurance companies, which is key. Next slide. And accepted, you know, coal, oil, and gas, as Susan said, they dominate the energy markets. They're right up there. It's practically impossible to see how on earth this is going to change. But a presentation I went to some time ago basically focused on a similar change that occurred between horses disappearing from the transport game and being replaced by cars. It took 10 years to break even in that massive change and about 50 years to complete that change. So just be aware that these transitions have occurred in the past. They occur on those times of timescales. Some of them occur a lot more rapidly. Next slide. And it's also clear that change is coming, as Susan also mentioned, that international finances, institutional financiers are pulling away from fossil fuels. They're pulling away from the risk side of things. BlackRock, the Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund have already announced this. Those are quite recent announcements. The next slide. And as Susan also said, there's the issue about where the activists going to take it next. There are already a series of voluntary standards out there, the Task Force on Climate Disclosure, things like ESG investing. And in fact, ESG investing has performed a lot better than any other kind of investing over the period of the crisis. And those things that are voluntary now can shift into regulations over time. And so that's another big question. The question of carbon taxes, removing subsidies from oil and gas systems, the question of emissions trading or having effective emissions trading, all of those issues are arising and being discussed right now. And then the other side of the game is the market opportunities. Obviously, renewables now are cheaper than any other source. The real question, though, rests in the storage systems and how we're going to solve this problem of storage. Electric vehicles prices are dropping. And probably will follow a similar pattern to solar panels. But the question of storage, whether or not use batteries or hydrogen, is key. And then also we're seeing the growth of new kinds of business models that are adapted to these new kinds of systems. Next slide. And already oil and gas is not performing well in global markets. It's one of the major shifts that we're starting to see over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of their performance against other kinds of investments. Next slide. And of course, the major companies are beginning to respond to this, and they are beginning to start looking at either exit strategies or how they're going to manage this. And Susan already pointed out in a much more sophisticated way than I did, the BP, Repsol, Shell are all thinking about this kind of thing. And I want to emphasize here that this interest in investing in renewable energy production, if that is scaled up massively, so if these companies actually shift to being energy companies and use renewable energy and solve storage problems, then the actual global transition can occur much more rapidly. Next slide. So what in terms of options? I mean, one set of options that has been discussed is the question of shifting more into petrochemicals. But I would say that plastics have their own challenges. We haven't done an in-depth analysis of this, but we're also pushing agendas on circular economy, which may have implications for this in the long term. I would also emphasize that focusing on scope 1 emissions is basically not enough. The activist programs, the investor programs are really quite sophisticated and really need to look at scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. Next slide. The issue of natural gas and biofuels have also been raised, of shifting to natural gas. I would be concerned, 1, from the stranded assets perspective. 2, actually natural gas or liquefied natural gas is not cheaper than renewables. And 3, what we're finding now is that actually natural gas emissions are much higher than previously estimated, in part because of leakages. It really is much dirtier than we thought. And in some cases, people are being producing publications documenting that in fact it could be as bad as coal. Biofuels are also highly complex. They compete with other kinds of food production. They compete with natural sinks, which are going to be necessary as part of the broader plan. And in general, they're not that good in terms of carbon efficiency. So those need a lot more analysis. Next slide. So as I wanted to finish up basically summarizing that, this shift to looking at companies as energy generation companies and refocusing on renewables and distribution, the question of new technologies, storage systems, batteries, or some of the ideas of basically using existing infrastructure for things like hydrogen or biogas, even though they're more risky, are potential options for the future. Next slide. But ultimately, I think that what we're facing is that this is, in essence, a time for choices that are going to depend on how companies see the outside world. From our perspective, what we see is that the changes here, it's transformational, the transitions are beginning. They seem to be accelerating depending on which geography you're in. There are technological changes, political changes, economic changes, and environmental changes that are occurring all the time. And systems are beginning to transition. Market opportunities are growing, market share is growing for things like renewables or electric cars. And policies are being put in place or are being developed to help drive that transition. I will note the caution that in fact in other countries that's being pushed backwards, and it depends on the political leadership or the leadership of the country to be able to decide what direction they're going in. Companies and countries will need to react to those changes and decide on what opportunities and what challenges they're going to address directly. And in fact, I repeat that the interest of the bank is to have that discussion and be able, and we really want to be part of that discussion to help guide and provide the information and knowledge that will help guide those kinds of decisions into the future. That's all I've got. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Graham. Very illustrative the way you presented. So we will have questions for you, Graham, when we finish with the next two presenters. So the next presenter is Jaime Martín Juez. He is the Executive Director for Technology and Corporate Venturing at Repsol. So just before giving the word to Jaime, I want to tell you that Repsol, as Susan presented in her presentation, was the first of the oil and gas companies to declare or to pledge the net zero emissions for 2050. And that sparked a whole other process of many other companies doing the same. So we'll be talking about that. Jaime will be talking about that. And just to give you an idea, Repsol is a Spanish company present in 34 countries. And they have an ambitious goal of transforming themselves from oil and gas company to energy company in the near future. So with that, Jaime, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you everyone for inviting us to share our vision regarding the future of the hydrocarbon sector. Well, as you have mentioned previously, what we pledged on last December regarding which was going to be our future in 2050 began 10 years before. I mean, we always mention this is like a marathon. This is not with a lot of sprints, but this is not just, okay, we wake up one morning last year, 2 years ago, this is in fashion, oh, well, we want to do something regarding climate change. You have to begin to work a long time ago. And we began, we were the first company, oil and gas company as well, who support the Kyoto Protocol. So we began there to realize that something was changing and that we want to be part of the solution, as you mentioned in the presentation. Next slide, please. I think I would like just to highlight some of the elements of the architecture of our strategy regarding what we are going to do in the future and what we are doing in the present regarding decarbonization. I think that every journey regarding this, it has to begin with a commitment, a really deep and really bold commitment. What do you want to do in the future? What is going to be your aim? And we mentioned and we established this commitment in December, saying, okay, we are sure that we want to be net zero in 2050, but this is not enough because it's a long term. I mean, in 40 years is too long to try to go there. So we have to have some kind of milestones in the journey, in the path, in order to say, okay, and we would like to do this and this and this decarbonization path with intermediate targets in 2020, 25, 2030, so on. So this is the aim, this is the long term, but at the same time, the short term goals that we have on that. At the same time, we have to describe, because when you say this, okay, achieve net zero emissions, what means? How you are going to break down this issue in different pieces? Well, so we have different kind of climate change targets. For example, we have this reduce carbon intensity by a 3% compared with our baselines in 2016, because we have a really accurate inventories from them. And this is a really ambitious one. But at the same time, we want to reduce a specific amount and a specific figure of tons during a period that is 3 million tons. We focus as well on methane. That is really a very, very big player in the upstream area. And we are really focused trying to address the issue regarding the methane emissions and reduce them and abatement by a 20% in 25 year. And the flaring, that is one of the main sources as well in the upstream in order to try to reduce these levels. So as you see, you have a global aim, you have with different milestones in the journey, but you have different specific targets for different divisions in the oil and gas. Because when you are talking about an oil and gas, you are talking about really different animals within this kind of companies. I mean, you are talking about upstream, they are dealing with these big projects offshore, onshore, where you have this flare, you have to pay attention in your not traditional production to the methane, for example, or non-conventional. And at the same time, you have this refining, petrochemical with big sources of CO2, when you have to address this kind of combustion, energy efficiency, and so on. But at the same time, if you want to pay attention to the scope 3, as Graham mentioned, you have to do something regarding your products, your retail, and so on. And you have to as well to diversify. Goldman Sachs remarked last February that Repsol is the company regarding its size who is investing the biggest figure of capex in renewables in the world, in the oil and gas sector, much more than BP, much more than Shell, and so on, in this kind of proportion terms. So you have to diversify. And how we track our emissions? We track in the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and regarding our production, energy generation. And this is another issue quite important. Not only the direct emissions, but also the life cycle of the products. And this is very important. When you take into account what is your footprint regarding carbon emissions, you have to take into account that regarding the carbon footprint since the very beginning of life cycle analysis. And this is quite important when you are trying to imagine different technology options like batteries, like renewables, or as it was mentioned, biofuels. When you put on these different technological or technology options on the table, you have to take into account this all life cycle of the products, and sometimes it's forgetting in the regulatory frameworks in different countries. Next slide, please. But one thing that is quite important when you are building up this kind of a strategy in the long term is how is going to be your conversation with your shareholders. How are you going to build up this trust with the people in order to say, okay, I am a reliable company and you can invest in us because we are going to give back you profits, and we are going to do that in a sustainable way. So the main issue to that is try to stack with different performance and disclosure standards, that there are many of them, and you have to report which is your progress in this journey. I mean, even if you are failing in order to achieve your targets, you have to report that, and you have to take this conversation in the global community, stakeholders, NGOs, society as a whole, like a real duty that every day with your broad shows, with your CEO, with your chairman, and with everyone in the company has to be committed to try to explain what we are trying to do in order to achieve these different goals in the metrics that they are required, but for example, the financial institutions. Next slide, please. As I mentioned previously, we have different targets in the future, and I would like to say something. In terms of long term, we don't know how we are going to achieve that. We don't know, because as we are more, the long term is bigger. The uncertainty regarding technology, because it has been mentioned previously, one of the main issues is the regulation, for sure. Other the main issues that is driving this climate change motion is the markets. But the third one that it has to be taken into account when you are building up a sound strategy in an oil and gas company is the technology itself. Because one of the main problems with this, the concern on the climate change topic, is that there is not a silver bullet. Renewables are not enough in order to address this problem. Even if we deploy as much renewables as we can and the capacity that we cannot solve many problems that we are facing regarding climate change. So we have to have this kind of carbon neutrality approach, trying to put and push all the different technologies that there are over there, that in order to try to speed up this technology process, in order to try to push the developments. And yes, we have to talk about biofuels, advanced biofuels, in order that embedded plastic waste, or embedded, for example, oil waste, or wherever, in the new kind of fuels. Or yes, we have to take into account the carbon capture and storage there as a real option in order to abate in a dramatical way and quite fast the emission of CO2. And the oil and gas sector could play a key role on that. We have to try to avoid this kind of debates where, okay, renewables are better than this one, batteries are better than this one. We have to put on the table everything, and each solution could address some kind of issue, for example, regarding mobility. When we are talking about emissions, in some cases, we are producing the emissions at the very beginning in the manufacture of the batteries. In other cases, we are doing at the very end. So we have to try to push this and to put in proportion when we are addressing this kind of strategies. Next slide, please. And I'm bringing you a specific example. We are really convinced that we have to try, and the oil and gas sector have a really key player, a key role, in order to administrate zero liquid fuels to the markets. Advanced fuels, that means that you take plastic waste or biomass, organic waste, that you are now currently disposal to the landfills and so on, and you take the biogas, or you take this one, you put into for example, high pressure pyrolysis plant, and you can deliver this gas from this waste and embed it in your refinery, and you can avoid the combustion of all the other fuels. So you are reducing in a very dramatical way that your emissions in the scope 1 and scope 2, and you are making reality the circular economy. Or you can take hydrogen, or sorry, water. You can break this molecule with electrolyzer with renewables, and you can produce green hydrogen. And with this hydrogen, and capture CO2 in your refinery, or even from the atmosphere, you can produce this new kind of synthetic liquid fuels. That is a real solution for many of the different mobility options, for example, for the air flights. So, and we have recently announced a big project regarding this in the north of Spain, in Europe, following the guidelines of the UN Green Deal that is being put in motion by the European Commission. So I think that the oil and gas companies have a real role in this decarbonization path, you have to take into account which is your reality, which is your main division within your company, upstream, downstream, the mixture of all of them. But all of them can make a contribution to this play and to this game. You have to have quite clear your idea in the long term, which is the technologies that you have to push in order to do that. And you have, for example, to rely as well in the innovation, startups. There are many very bright people outside that they are doing amazing things that you can take into account and try to get into your companies in order to speed up these processes. So I really emphasize, and I really agree with the Christian Gisler introduction regarding that. I am very convinced that the oil and gas sector could be a really very important player in the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Like your slide of the current situation and the future one. We'll get into that when we get to the questions.
Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce the fourth and last speaker. He is Paulo Barcena. He's the head of corporate strategy at Ecopetrol. So Ecopetrol is a national oil company of Colombia. It's the third largest oil company in Latin America and the Caribbean. Has operations in Colombia, Brazil, United States, and Mexico. And to give you an idea, in terms of production, is similar to what Repsol is doing. Repsol, Ecopetrol is committed to the mitigation of climate change, and they have some goals to reducing 20% of their carbon by 2030. Now, in talking with Paulo, you will hear a more pragmatic view of what it means for a national oil company to deal with these challenges of the future. And we are really very fortunate to have Paulo with us to give us that perspective. So Paulo, with that, the topic of your presentation is decarbonization and diversification strategies and challenges from the context of a national oil company. Paulo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, talking about how important it is to phase out of hydrocarbons in terms of avoiding climate change, and how all these international companies like the majors, like Repsol, are trying to shift from an oil and gas pure company towards more like an energy company, thinking about either just generation or seeing the entire value chain of energy. And also thinking about the decarbonization as part of how making viable the oil that we will keep producing in the future. I would want to start with the discussion on how it can be possible, or how it can't be possible, to phase out from hydrocarbons. And let's think about countries, how they depend also economically from hydrocarbons. Mostly these Middle Eastern countries or Latin American countries, like Colombia, like Mexico, like Brazil, that it's an important part of their economy, the development of the hydrocarbons. So when we think about the energy matrix in the future, in any of, even in the greener projections of energy production or energy consumption, we still see that oil and gas is going to be playing a major part of it. And not only gas, which is the transition fuel, but also oil. So the big question is how we can actually make oil viable, or hydrocarbon fuels viable in this future. And that's how the entire decarbonization comes into place. Countries or companies that have the mandate to develop the national resources need to think how we can actually ensure that these natural resources in the future are still going to be viable in a future that is fighting to climate change. So the entire decarbonization comes through the entire process of how we can actually start making a lower carbon footprint oil, not only in scope 1 and scope 2, but thinking about how to start reducing emissions in scope 3, thinking about, for example, reforestation, restoration of natural areas, thinking about carbon capture usage and storage at the beginning, and then thinking carbon capture and storage, and thinking how these economies in the future with a potential carbon tax, or somehow making an offset on the costs of the carbon towards other parts of the value chain, actually helps us to think about how to make viable and how to make competitive that type of oil in the future. And that is one of the part of the discussion, and that's why companies like Ecopetrol is thinking in getting into partnerships and working together with the majors and the big companies towards ensuring that the oil that we will have to be producing in the future is going to be viable, is going to be competitive, and is going to be low carbon. Then we switch towards the diversification, and here is a more complex discussion for the national oil companies than it possibly could be for international or major companies. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, they are already international companies. They already think in a client view, for example, as we were seeing in the Repsol presentation, or more towards I'm an oil and gas producer. I might be an oil and an electricity generator. But for national oil companies, what we need to think about is what might be a viable and interesting business that is friendly or could work with the energy transition, but within the country that you are in. National oil companies have 95, 98% of their business in their own country. Even Equinor, that is the most international oil and gas, national oil and gas company that there is, still has like 80-70% of their business in Norway, in their own country. So it's kind of like thinking about diversification. It's not a direct answer for national oil companies that, yeah, we need to become an energy company. And also the problem is that the markets are pushing every oil and gas company towards the energy market. And what we need to think about is what is going to be a viable business that helps in the development of the country, that is an attractive business within the country that we are in and that is going to give our shareholders the returns that they are expecting from us, thinking about, for example, national oil companies, not only the government, but other companies that actually invest in national oil companies, and that they're gonna still see a national oil company and Ecopetrol or an oil and gas company as a viable investment opportunity and option. So that's the point where Ecopetrol is right now. That's what we're thinking. That's what we're discussing, and we're trying to assess the discussion of diversification as how we can actually make a company that is very attractive for investors, that can take advantage of the opportunities that a country like Colombia, for example, in our case, has. And also, for example, when we think about the entire pandemic of the COVID-19, it is more important to think about that any type of business that we think we could develop besides oil and gas can also help the country that we're in developing and getting out of the economic crisis that comes after the pandemic. So it's not a straightforward answer. It's a complicated one that needs to be carefully chosen in order to be able to choose the right business for the right company. So that was the discussion that I wanted to put forward, and I don't know if we can jump to the questions.
Thank you, Paulo. So let's start with the questions, and perhaps we can start directly with you. I want to make some of my own questions because I was curious of the whole discussion, and then we can open it to the rest of the let's say the rest of the audience. So in your case, Paulo, in order to accelerate, you were saying, okay, how do I make this interesting for investors to invest in Colombia in the case of Ecopetrol? So I'm thinking, what technologies or options do you see that could become viable in the near future in Colombia, for example, to decarbonize or to make a different path, or to something that goes along the decarbonization path for Ecopetrol?
I would say first, since we're starting this journey, we still have a lot of low hanging fruit investments that we're looking to make. Without this big change in technology, we're just thinking about like zero flaring, for example, zero flaring, changing the burners in the flaring system so that they are actually much better equipped with a better combustion if we need to flare. We're thinking about fugitive emissions, which is one of the main concerns when we have like old infrastructure. So we're thinking about new technologies on how to detect these fugitive emissions, mostly in our big industrial areas, like the two refineries, like the gas treatment plants, and also we want to reduce any type of methane, either leakage or purpose release. For example, all our tanks of storage tanks, we're thinking that changing the technology towards newer technology like floating ceilings that can avoid actually releasing this methane to the atmosphere. So this is, but it's not a big change in technology. The one that could potentially be very useful is the infrared technology in detecting methane emissions. We're starting to make tests, pilots in the refineries, to actually be able to ensure that we don't have this type of leakage, and also to be able to implement this technology into making less pollutant, less emissions in the entire gas value chain. So those is from the technology point of view. On the other side, we have a lot of calls, a lot of potential JVs regarding reforestation and restoration. So we're actually developing what could be a economically viable solution for thinking about the offset, thinking about using this opportunity for reforestation in Colombia, and also using this as a potential job creation in areas which that by how far away are from big urban centers, typically are very poor, and it could be a potential also opportunity to create some jobs in areas that require reforestation. So it's kind of like this is the first levers that we're discussing right now, and we expect this year to make an announcement, either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, regarding these plans, and then taking into the phase 2 of now we need to start thinking about really deep technologies like potentially green hydrogen in the refineries, like other type of like CCUS in some of our enhanced oil recovery reservoirs that could be used. So we're starting to think about how could this phase 2 look like in order to meet the targets and potentially have more aggressive targets?
Thank you, Paulo. And Jaime, more or less in the same line of questioning as Paulo, he mentioned green hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. You showed it in your presentation in the slide of the future. Where are the technologies that you think that would require support now, so that we can have them more viable, more commercially available, let's say in 5 to 10 years from now? Sort of like the same what happened with solar, that 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, solar was perhaps not as viable not viable as today it is, right? But there was a strong push from the multilaterals, from the community in general, that makes it viable. So from that point of view, what technologies should we try to bet on so that we can have a viable, solutions in 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, let me, I would say that the solar is not only the push that was from multilaterals and so on, because in Spain, you know that we were the very first mover on this. 10 years ago, we were the leader in the world regarding renewable and solar installation, but the real push came from China and the manufacturing side. So when you scale up in a massive way a specific technology, that's it, that's the game. So what we have a bunch of different technologies at this stage. I mean, that they are not rocket science, but they are in this TRL 8, 7, in order to jump to the 9, trying to do that in a commercial way and a commercial stage. And we could mention, for example, carbon capture and storage. As oil and gas companies, we have been doing that for years and years, 70 years. And the 45Q, this is a tax incentive in the US, has pushed up a lot of these kind of different projects. And it's something that we have to just only scale up. I'm a member of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative that is trying to scale up different initiatives and different technologies in the world. And one of our main goals is to do that with the CCUS, is to make that in a reality. And we are trying to build up this kind of hubs of CCUS in order to abate the numbers, the figures, and do that in an efficient and profitable way. But we can do that in a massive way. Rotterdam, Houston, Stavanger, in the north of UK. So it could be a reality in the short term. And you don't have to choose between renewables and CCUS. You have to do both in order to achieve the zero goal term in the long term. But the green hydrogen is another one, where our petrochemical facilities can roll a very important, we can play a very important role. We can do that in order to produce this electricity from very cheap renewables there in our refineries. And you have to take into account that we are one of the main clients and consumers of hydrogen in our refineries. At 20–25% of our emissions, direct emissions in our refineries, they are from our steam reformers. If we try to remove them and we put that and replace with this hydrogen, green hydrogen, it will be a real push in the short term in order to do that. And we have really feasible technologies that they are waiting just in order to scale up them. And with this hydrogen, you can do that a lot of things. Not only replace steam reforming, you can also inject it daily in your pipelines of natural gas. Now, not tomorrow. You don't have to build up a new infrastructure of pipelines and so on. You can try to mix with your natural gas in order to lower the carbon footprints of the natural gas. But also you can use this hydrogen for the long-term storage of electricity. Because if you have power and you have batteries, okay, you are going to do that for hours, 4 hours at maximum. But if you want to replace this, massive storage for the long term, between seasons, for example, you can use this hydrogen. So the hydrogen is a real energy vector for the future. or even taking into account for the mobility. But you can take this in hydrogen in order to try to transform with the CO2 that you are capturing from your refineries or even from the atmosphere and trying to build up these zero liquid fuels. So there are a lot of different initiatives there only waiting this push to scale up.
Thank you very much. And I am always thinking about this hydrogen. We have started to do a lot of in hydrogen. I think we can do much more, but the simple fact that if using hydrogen, we can use the installed capacity of existing plants today. We can use the skills of the people in the jobs today. And we are not emitting. I mean, it's wonderful. It's just how to make it cheaper, how to make it more attractive, how to make it, you know, more viable. So, you know.
Totally, yeah.
So from that point of view, Graham, how do we accelerate with the tools that we have at the IDB, this net zero 2050? How do we can, you know, accelerate this transformation?
Okay, well, right from the get-go, I think it's excellent that Repsol, Ecopetrol, Shell, and BP are really thinking through these issues now. They're critical actors for the future and for moving things forward. And I just wanted to emphasize that one of the things that we've been trying to do with countries is really to get that planning process aligned. And one of the mechanisms we've used for that is to really to develop long-term strategies. And in developing long-term strategies, clearly, as basically we've seen already, that there's a lot of uncertainty into the future. I mean, you can't predict what's going to happen with technologies in the next 30 years. It's impossible to do. So a lot of that planning is done based on modeling. And I just wanted to emphasize that based on the modeling that we have today, if you really want to get to 1.5 or 2 degrees, as you saw in the gaps in Susan's graph, it really requires phasing out the existing approaches to oil, gas, and coal. I just want to put that on the table. However, there are mechanisms and there is a lot of potential for drawing in those companies, those groups that are involved in this, to be able to put in place the technologies that are required. And we have a lot, as you've mentioned already, that there's a lot of lessons learned through the processes of supporting or using concessional finance, using taxation systems, using policy systems to drive the agenda for renewable energy. There's a lot of lessons learned on what works, what doesn't work, and how you can move forward. But I think the key to all of this process is that all of these discussions need to be brought together under an initial approach to a long-term strategy, then converted directly into these documents that are called nationally determined contributions at the level of the country, and then directly into the question of what are the investment plans, what are the key areas for investment, including for investing concessional finance into those systems. I also sort of want to go back to a point that Pablo made, is that and his very interesting idea of the reforestation and natural sinks, that all of this stuff now has to be done in the context of moving from the rescue phase to the recovery phase from COVID. So it's all about how future investments are going to be balanced in that context. And some of those ideas, that idea in particular of the joint ventures on reforestation and natural sinks and the amount of job opportunities that can be created, is actually something that's already being discussed and on the table with respect to one of the mechanisms that you can get people back to work very quickly. And I think that it's about picking, right in the short term, it's about picking some of those options that are going to work very rapidly. In most of our discussions, there's a lot of interest, for example, in moving forward some of these changes that cities want to see in terms of shifting from vehicle-based transportation to bicycle and walking-based transportation, so that these are the kinds of issues that are being discussed right away. And I think this is actually right now is the time to begin those discussions with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, even though we're right at the sort of the peak of the problem in Latin America and the Caribbean right now. A lot of people within the countries are starting to think, okay, well, what do we do once we've dealt with the health challenges? Because we have this huge economic challenge that's coming up. And one of the keys there is how do we incorporate a lot of these ideas into that way of moving forward in the future. So that I think that we know how to do some of these things. We know how to bring in new technologies. We know how to create new market spaces. We've learned a great deal over the last 10, 15 years. And we need to apply some of these to this area of work. And I repeat what I said at the beginning, that these companies, the oil and gas companies, are critical elements for this discussion and really need to be part of the discussion as we move forward in terms of planning. We need to understand what are the possible options, and we need to be able to apply some of our lessons learned to those options.
Thanks, Graham. And Susan, more or less in line with Graham's question, how do we accelerate the net zero toward, earlier than 2050? And in your graph, you saw very, as Graham said, you presented very elegantly, those countries who were pushing towards using their stimulus packages in a positive way towards a greener outcomes, and others not that much. How do we convince those who are not going in the, let's say, greener direction, or the national oil companies who have basically other interests? How do we get to that market? How do we make them more attractive so that they can join this movement?
Well, remember that particular chart was really what's happening right now, but it certainly, all of these rescue and recovery programs are going to have implications for at least 5 years, for sure. The countries that are the most active are Europe. And we must remind ourselves that Europe is not the biggest emitter. The biggest emitters are China, US, India. We need actions. If we only ever talk about Europe, Europe is the leader. There's no question about that. They are absolutely at the forefront. But the actions at a country level have to take place in the other countries in order to actually affect change. And I very much appreciate the balance of this panel, because it has reinforced that it is not one thing only. There's not one answer. Renewables is not the answer. Renewables is the only thing. It's just not. We have this huge infrastructure that changes over time. And what we see happening is if you could incentivize, for example, decarbonization. So the companies themselves are doing it, which they should, because it makes a much greener production. CCUS is another one. CCUS is growing. There's a lot of interest in it, but it's still very small. It's nowhere near what it could be if it were incentivized in some way, either direct incentives, or there are taxes that make it more economic to do that. There are multiple ways to do this, or mandated. The other thing is fuel economy standards. Over 60% of oil demand is for transport. And over time, we have penetration of electric vehicles. Now, of course, it depends upon where the electricity comes from, right? When you look at the totality of it. But over time, we have penetration of electric vehicles, and it's very high in new sales in some projections, in ours as well. But the fleet turns over, so you still have an infrastructure. And when we somehow sometimes miss how long it actually takes to affect these things in a realistic way. It can move much faster, yes, but it's by incentivizing not only renewables, but also the decarbonization of the existing production. And that would really help enormously. And the other thing that we've observed from our clients and been told by our clients is when they have a mandate to reduce their emissions and they go out to actually do that, they reduce costs as well. It has been something which they have found maybe remarkable, but the mandate from the top to reduce emissions by 30% results in such creativity that you end up reprogramming the way you do things. And perhaps the other panelists could comment on that. I see Jaime nodding, that you get much more efficient. So you produce a much better operation than you did before you started.
Thanks, Susan. A question from the audience. and this is to you, Susan. If you can elaborate a little more on the strategic issues of the decarbonization scenarios. So in the point of view of the person who's making the question, is it going to demand driven or supply, or it will be the demand driven or supply driven, this change, right? Or is it a demand driven scenario has more probability to occur, or is it going to be led by new non-incumbent players or companies? So who is actually going to produce this new change? Is it from the oil companies themselves? Can we expect that from them? Or is it something driven by an external force, like what Graham showed with the situation of coal in the UK?
Well, the analogy to coal becoming less and less economic is certainly true in the power sector. The power sector is increasingly going towards renewables because it's the cheaper option. It's not always the cheaper option, but it often is the cheaper option. And I would say that it's both demand and supply. I mean, I'm an economist. I have to say it's both demand and supply. So let's look at demand. How do you impact demand? One, it can be, there's generational change taking place. And we can't underestimate that. There's generational change taking place, which is going to prefer different alternatives to what we have done in the past. But second, you influence demand by changing prices. So when we use carbon prices, that there's a price to the producer, and then there's an effective price to the consumer, which changes behavior. And that lowers demand for certain types of fuels, depending upon how you apply it. The supply side, I think, is a really interesting question, in that there are a lot of new players coming in. I mean, it was mentioned that the solar prices dropped dramatically because China decided that it wanted to dominate solar production, solar panel production, and it has. And that has just dramatically dropped the price. The technology changes in wind turbines, where they get taller and more efficient. They could capture more. The utilization goes way up, and the production goes way up. These are supply side. Hydrogen as well, a lot of interest in that. Also on the supply side, this decarbonizing of your existing operations. The car companies, it's not just oil and gas companies, it's the transport companies are working on this too. Maybe we'll phase out the internal combustion engine, but until we do, there are a lot of efficiencies being gained there. So there are a lot of new players jumping into this business. As our panelists have mentioned, they're doing JVs, all sorts of technology startups, and there is a tremendous amount going on in the space.
Thank you. Well, you know, time flies. We're about 5 minutes away to closing the panel, and I would like to do it in the same way we do it with the political debates, that we give 1 minute to each candidate. In this case, you're not a candidate, but a panelist, to express your most important thought or the most important idea that the audience should stay with it, and so that they can take them with that idea home. So let's start with Jaime.
Well, I would like to remark and highlight this last statement, this idea, technology neutrality. We have to avoid any kind of bias regarding this issue, because it's pretty important to take on board every idea, every different situation with different countries and so on. It was mentioned by Susan Farrell, and I was noting that this is really a big incentive for people. If you go there and you ask your people in your facilities and your refinery, and I was in charge of one of these programs within our company in order to gain efficiency. If you tell them, okay, you are fighting for the climate change, they will come back to their homes during the night and will tell their kids, we are doing something right, and you are saving the world, okay? And you commit that with a CO2 target, and it's not this only CO2 target, very nice one. We increase our margin per barrel in $1. So we used to be in the top quartile in refining Solomon indexes, but after this program, we stayed there for as long as we have been until now, because we were fighting the climate change. And that was the idea. Every panelist, every people there in the refineries, they were thinking how we could avoid these emissions. So technology neutrality, the main idea I would like to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Paulo, your last words, please.
Well, what I would say is that we have to think that oil and gas is going to still be part of the energy matrix, at least until 2050. So when you said, what is this big next jump in technology that is required, definitely is the carbon capture and storage. That is definitely something that the cheaper we can make that process, the better, the low carbon, the cleaner the oil and also fuels can become. And actually it can be the lever that not only ensures the continuance of the developing of countries that depend on oil and gas, but also the faster we can actually reduce emissions without expecting a huge shift from technologies, from mobility, et cetera, and also big other new investments that require these new technologies. So I would say, let's try to bet on that technology for being the next solar panel, but now in terms of how to reduce the risk of climate change.
Thanks, Paulo. And Graham, your last words.
Okay, so I have three messages mainly. I mean, I think the first one is that we have to think in a long-term context. We can't be thinking about next year or the next 5 years, even though we are post-COVID, in which case we're going to have to think about jobs right now, liquidity and other kinds of immediate issues. But we need to think about what the impacts of that are going to be in the long term. And I think that this question of developing long-term strategies and thinking through in the long term what's actually going to happen is critical. And then feeding that back down into nationally determined contributions, the investment plans that are required, and the policy and business shifts that are going to have to take place. So that's my first key message. The second key message is that we need to be strategic. And by being strategic, I mean you have to look at the tools that we have to be able to advance technological changes, open up market opportunities or enhance market opportunities or bring market opportunities to scale. What kinds of policy changes are going to actually change? And I do think that all of these things are going to be sort of nationally specific, or in some cases actually may even be subnationally specific to cities. But the design of those things should be to basically accelerate transitions. And I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that to do those kinds of things, institutions need to be strong. Otherwise, none of it's going to happen. And then I think in terms of the sector areas, I actually think the power sector is already beginning to move. It's already beginning to shift. Transportation is a little bit behind, but it's also beginning to shift. But then there are areas like buildings, logistics. One of the biggest areas that was raised is the question of aviation. What are we going to do with that? Shipping is another huge area. And we still have the big problem of agriculture and land use and about how to manage emissions from those areas as well in terms of sectors. And I think that if we think about all three of those things and we think about that as a package, but then place that in the context of what our economic recovery is going to look like coming out of COVID, then I think we would be at a good starting point for advancing the agenda.
Thank you. And Susan, your last words, and we have to finish in about a minute.
I'll finish in less than a minute. The period, I'm going to go right back to my first comments, that this pandemic and recession, the depth and duration are so fundamental that it is going to be transformative. There are innovative ideas coming out of this. There are pressures from stakeholders coming out of it. And companies are really rethinking how they do things, as are governments and as are the joint venture and tech groups. So I think we're going to see very different approach to what has to be done and what can be done going forward as we come out of this crisis.
Thank you, Susan. I want to thank all the panelists, also to Paola Carvajal, who supported in the tech, our tech operators for allowing this panel to occur. And just for the closing remarks from myself is, I think that we cannot play this game alone. We need to play together with the oil and gas companies. There is will from the sector to change. We can see that from the presentations, but it's important to do it together, and that we are part of the solution and not only part of the problem, as is perceived many times. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.